Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or seeking to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as clinical psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back, Richard. Yesterday's podcast was a little bit longer than usual, but today's maybe as well. We're going to do our best to keep it
We
nice
can probably
and
make this short
concise.
and sweet.
Yeah.
The problem is, remember in the old days I used to say, I really like...
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say that.
Like 2 weeks ago.
I'm not going to say... It was a long time. Months ago. This article really excited me.
Yeah, this is a good article. This is from the Huffington Post.
That's right. We mentioned yesterday in our podcast that the world of addiction and substance use and substance abuse is going through some significant changes. And I think very positive changes.
Yeah.
And I think we're coming to terms with substance abuse in new ways that are very positive, very helpful, going to be very useful. And this article captures much of that, many of those changes. Okay, so this is I think of all the things we're going to talk about this week, I think this is really a pivotal piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So today we're going to try to get at the root of substance abuse and addiction and all of that jazz, because again, as we kind of talked about yesterday, addiction, that physiological or even psychological addiction to something, comes as a consequence of a drive of some sort or for some reason to use a particular substance or particular activity.
Right.
And it is important that we incorporate activity when we talk about addiction, because we typically think of alcohol and drugs and things like that when it comes to addictions, but there certainly are behaviors that we engage in that are somewhat addictive as well, or serve that same addictive purpose.
So behaviors will do the same thing as substances.
Right.
Right. Doesn't have to be a substance. It could be a behavior.
Right. So this article came from, as we said, the Huffington Post. It's called "The Likely Cause of Addiction Has Been Discovered, and It's Not What You Think."
Yeah. What I was going to say, aptly named, aptly titled, "The Likely Cause of Addiction Has Been Discovered, and It's Not What You Think."
Yeah.
I say an apt title because of what he, the little journey that he takes us on.
Yeah, so again, we won't go into all the details, but the link's in the show notes. I think that there's some key points that are really important for us to point out here. Kind of alluded yesterday to the perspective or the idea or the fact, it could be. There will be some that would debate, but what we believe is the likelihood that mental health issues and or physical health issues, which I think is important to add in there, are likely the root cause of substance abuse issues. He talks about, in many ways, he talks about sort of the root of some of those mental health issues.
He really does, because what I like about the way he set the table here is he said, we have typically viewed addiction as a brain problem. Okay, on the one hand, you have, he said, he sort of politicizes it, where he says on the far left,
right?
Okay, you have, but it's really not a left-right issue. On at one end of the spectrum, you have that the brain gets hijacked. You have this inherited characteristic of needing more of a certain neurotransmitter, and so your brain gets hijacked, and you can't do anything about it. It's a physical disease.
Right.
At the other end of the spectrum is addiction is a moral failing.
Right.
It's a failure of character. Okay. And so he said it's really neither of those extremes. It's something. That's what he means by, and it's not what you think. So it's neither one of those. Yeah,
because, and if we think about those two ends of the spectrum, and we've talked about this before, and it feels like it comes up all the time, and it makes me insane, it is who's to blame?
Right.
Okay, so if If it's over on this left side end of the spectrum, where it's just a disease, it's an illness, that means that there's, the person, him or herself, is not to blame. They can't help it. It's just what biology gave them, and they have no control over it. It is just the cards that they were dealt. On the other end of the spectrum, it's completely their fault.
Right.
It is 100% their fault because it's a moral failing. They should know better. They should do better. And never do we have a situation where it's one of those types of extremes.
And the first thing he says, it's much more complex. Whatever this is, it's far more complex than that.
Right.
And that's what all of the new definitions are saying, that this is a complex, addiction and abuse is a complex disorder. And you can't say it's this or this or this or this. It's complex in each individual.
Right.
And you have to understand the complexity in order to move toward treatment, effective treatments.
Right.
Okay.
So as we're about to get into some of the mental health pieces to it, again, as I mentioned a minute ago, we need to make sure that we add in the physical piece because, and I think that this makes intuitive sense. If you are a person who is in chronic pain, if you're, have chronic medical issues that create pain or discomfort or problems for you, the risk for addiction or substance abuse is there simply to relieve pain, simply to relieve, and I say simply, not to minimize it, but it would make sense that would be the relationship there.
Right.
Now, so putting that into one group of abusers there, or substance abusers there, the others are more mental health related. And it has to do, and as he talks about in this article, he talks about relationships, and he talks about bonding, and he talks about sort of the root of our mental health that starts early in life.
Right. And I love the way he gets us to bonding, okay? Because what he said, he acknowledges, early on in the article, he acknowledges that you can really get addicted, and he talks physiologically addicted.
Right.
And he talks about the rat experiments, which you and I are well aware of because it's part of introductory psychology, where if you put a rat in a cage and you have water with cocaine in it, the rat is going to go to the cocaine until it dies. I mean, it's just going to keep going until it's going to give up everything else, including food and everything, and it's going to keep doing it until it expires. Okay?
Right.
So he says, clearly there's some biological process going on here. But he said the experimenter developed something called Rat Park. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I missed this part of the experiment in my psychology class.
Yeah.
But he talks about Rat Park. Rat Park was this. It was sort of Disneyland for rats. And when you take the addicted rats, so they would get the rats addicted to cocaine, but before they killed themselves, he took them out of that barren cage where there was just the drug and put them into Rat Park, and they recovered. And they lost their addiction. And he said that
because the cocaine water was still available, but they were choosing not to use it.
They didn't need it. Okay?
Right.
They satisfied, and this raised the whole issue of, well, wait a minute, why does a change in environment change that addictive behavior? And then he talked about the soldiers in Vietnam. He said we had this human experiment that we didn't really realize at the time, where large numbers of soldiers got hooked to heroin while they were in Vietnam. But and they were truly addicted. All the stuff that we talked about yesterday, they were truly addicted. Their brains were hooked. 95% of those returning soldiers stopped using when they got back to the United States without treatment, without withdrawal, without treatment. They had minor withdrawal. But the change in environment somehow helped them. I don't know what word to use. The change in environment changed the addictive behavior. No treatments, nothing else happened. Just moving from that country to this country. So then the conclusion that he reached is there's some other factor involved in addiction, and he said it's human connection. or bonding.
Bonding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about this study and this idea is that not only was the recovery remarkable, but it really coincides with everything that we've been talking about the last couple podcasts, in that when you're under duress, when you're, when we think about, whether we think about the rat studies, you refer to it as a barren cage. It very much so is. It's just an empty cage with water bottles and a little food dish, and that's about it.
Right.
As compared to Rat Park, which has all these different other rats, and it has other activities for the rats to do. When you think about the Vietnam observation, what it is we're eliminating stress.
Right.
We're eliminating psychosocial stressors.
Whatever we talked about this yesterday. You talked about it at length yesterday. Whatever you're feeling, you're trying to end that feeling. You're trying to address that felt need.
Right.
Okay. You're sitting in a jungle in a war zone. You have a felt need.
You're stressed.
Maybe you have a felt need. Okay. And you're using the drug to help you deal with whatever that is.
Right.
Okay. Once you remove whatever that is, you remove the need. Right. Yeah. The dependence, the addiction on the drug.
Right. And we see this play out in people all the time. Think about a person that who has a history of smoking, for example. Maybe quit. And so they had smoked for a while, and then they quit. And they were, maybe they didn't smoke for years.
10 years. I've had people say, I haven't smoked for 10 years.
Yeah.
I started again.
Yeah. They get under some particular stressor.
Right.
Something new is happening that's putting pressure on them.
Right.
And they start smoking again.
The
need is there again.
Right. You know what alarmed me?
I'm not even talking about marijuana. I'm even talking about cigarettes.
Just a cigarette.
Yeah.
Right. Well, just a cigarette. But the alarming part of this is we see the incidence of particularly alcohol abuse increases in the elderly. It increases especially in widows. And I never made this connection before, but there's the loneliness.
Right.
Okay, they were alone. Their friends are dying off. They're less able to get out. Maybe they don't drive anymore, and they're dependent on others for transportation. And the other group is mothers. When they're locked inside with children, especially if you live up north, you're inside most of the day with young children. You're feeling very isolated, and you have this need for connecting to others.
Right.
And if your children aren't providing it, or your children are difficult, you're at increased risk to satisfy that need with some substance or some activity.
Right. Yeah. So there's this, this combination of psychological and psychosocial factors that influence our risk for substance abuse.
That's right.
Whether it's feeling lonely, whether it's feeling depressed, feeling overly anxious, excessively stressed, whatever the case may be, when we experience that discomfort, we seek strategies for relieving that discomfort.
Right. That's right.
And oftentimes, unfortunately, that relief comes from substance abuse.
The other fascinating part of this, and I wished I would have thought of this when I first heard about it, because I remember when the nicotine patch first came out. Do you remember? Because you were doing work with Tourette's, using nicotine.
The nicotine patch, right?
I don't remember exactly what year it came out, but it was like this miracle, because now you were going to satisfy that nicotine craving with a patch, so you wouldn't have to smoke cigarettes. The nicotine patch was only successful with 17% of smokers, which means it's not addiction to nicotine alone.
Right.
Because if it was just nicotine, the patch nobody would be smoking.
Right.
In the country.
Right.
There's something else going on that we're only now beginning to understand.
Yeah.
And that's the fascinating part of this work. And later this week, we're going to have an interview.
Yes.
With?
Alistair Morty.
Alistair Morty. And he took these ideas and developed, moved all the way to Thailand from England, and has incorporated these ideas into his addiction treatment program, which is a fascinating application of these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So look forward to that. Take a look. Listen to that interview that's coming up later this week.
Yeah, it's a great interview.
And he talks about this book, Chasing the Scream.
Yeah, they're doing some pretty amazing things. So
right, they really are, because I mean, when you see what he's done, their treatment program does these things. It connections and one of the things he says is you can't ask addicts just to stop,
right,
without replacing it with something.
Yeah,
you know.
So he used the analogy, if you're blind and then I give you something and you can see,
right,
and then I say, okay, now give it back,
right,
you're going to be really upset because you could see for the first time, you know,
right.
and that's what happens when we just try to remove the substance use and we're not replacing it with something that sort of serves a similar purpose for them.
So again, to summarize what he said at the beginning of the article, what Harry said at the beginning of the article, is it's neither a chemical hijacking,
right,
nor is it a moral failing.
Right.
There's some other mediating factor here that we need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, we did a good job of getting that nice
in and out.
Concise. Yeah, so
okay.
Perfect. So we'll be back tomorrow with a little bit more about substance abuse and addiction. So until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.